Hi, my name's Cam, welcome to Rogue's Roll Call. I make lots of videos about D&D and TTRPGs in general, so if that's your kind of thing, if you're a player, a DM, or even just interested, I would love it if you stuck around. Now we're gonna get right into it, but I just want to very quickly say that this video isn't me giving you advice. This video is more so just me sharing things that I had to learn the hard way, because I'm still a pretty new DM myself. I'm pretty sure I'm just under the 2-year mark as a dungeon master, and I am very far from perfect, but I do think I'm a lot better than I used to be, and it's because of things like what we're about to discuss. But of course, if you have anything you had to learn the hard way as a player or a DM, then I would love to hear it. Let me know in the comments. So here's one that I definitely had to learn the hard way, and I suppose it could depend on the players at your table and what they prefer and what they like to see in the campaign that you're setting out for them. But in short, don't overdo it. I will explain. I'll give you an example. So for my very first homebrewed campaign, not my first campaign, but the first campaign that I homebrewed myself, I planned this extremely epic plot where a banished god opens a rift in the sky, and a bunch of cultists from another plane of existence start pouring through that rift and into our world. Those cultists would then spread a plague, a sickness, across the entire world. Well, that's their aim, is to spread a sickness across the world, and then they were planning to trick all of the common people into believing that the solution, the cure to this plague that has miraculously come out of nowhere, is to pray to that banished god, thus imbuing that god with enough power to break free from that banishment and return to this world. Now obviously I'm a bit biased, but I think that's a pretty cool idea, but I decided that the story also needed personal stakes for the players, so I decided to have them contract that plague, that sickness. A very special kind of sickness that can't be cured by any common or even magical means. And I think that's fine, in theory. It gives the players an incentive to see this story through. It also adds a bit of a ticking clock, which I think is good in most cases for a campaign or a story in general. Adding that giant ticking clock over the entire campaign in itself isn't really a bad thing, but with it directly impacting the health and the well-being of my players, I found that they were now avoiding side quests because they were worried that they would be wasting time that could be better spent trying to save their own lives because of the plague. Basically, I had made it feel like they can't dedicate any time to anything except curing themselves. In short, I overdid it a bit, and in doing so I had put a bit of a wet blanket over one of the funnest parts of Dungeons & Dragons, the random fun little side quests. Now that's all okay, I can fix it, the campaign's still going, I have plenty of plans to kind of amend this, but it is a lesson that I have learned the hard way. Having a big epic world-ending stakes plot is okay, in moderation. But I think it's probably better to not introduce a ticking clock right away, or at least not have the ticking clock be so dangerous so soon in the campaign. That way the players can feel completely comfortable exploring or goofing around as D&D players often do. At the core of D&D and TTRPGs in general, one of the most important things for the players is to be able to feel like they have the freedom to explore and do whatever they want, really. And at the end of the day, even though I didn't mean to, I imposed some pretty hard limitations on that freedom. I know, I'm sure people have told you 1,000 times or more to keep notes as the player and the DM. I get it, but I want to elaborate on that. I want to hone in on that and talk about some of the specific stuff that I think is super important to keep notes on. First off, names. Everyone says to keep a list of names behind the DM screen. Absolutely, do that. Trust me. But also, when you're a DM and you're improvising and you make up an NPC or a place or an item or whatever, note it down. I know it's very easy to forget to do that when you're in the zone and you're weaving the best story that your players have ever heard, but I can't tell you how frustrating and, to be honest, even a little bit embarrassing it is when a few sessions later your players decide to visit that NPC or that place, and you, the DM, have to ask your players what the name was, hoping that they kept notes on that as well. Also take notes on things that you have to look up during the session. If you're playing, especially during an encounter, and you have to look up a rule or a spell or whatever, take a note. The note doesn't have to be in-depth or anything. For example, if you have to look up how counterspells work, just note down counterspell. Then sometime before the next session, find that list you made of stuff that you had to look up and have another read. You might want to assume that you'll just remember this stuff in the moment during the encounter. But what I have found, and maybe it's not the same for you, but what I've found is that in that stressful situation, when you're rushing to keep the combat moving and keep it exciting and you're having to stop and look up stuff, the chances of you forgetting it all just a bit later is pretty high. So yeah, this is something I started doing a while back and it has helped me a ton. I think something that a lot of DMs struggle with or have a lot of insecurity about is how much knowledge they have. How easily they're able to just know certain things when a player asks, and doing this, taking notes on stuff that you have to look up along the way and then having another look at it later after the session, it's gonna help. Also, take notes of major story developments through the session. I have a really good reason for this and we'll get into that in the very next point. So, keeping notes during the session on major story developments, that was for this. Session recaps. To be very clear, you do not need to do this. This is probably one of the most extra, unnecessary DM things that I do, but I kind of love it. I think it's pretty great. After every session, I will go to my computer and I'll type up the highlights and the important moments that happened during that session, or the funny moments, or basically just stuff that you think you or the players would want to remember. Very important thing to know here, I am not typing this up like it's a short story, like a narrative. It is quite literally just dot points. I started doing this mostly so that my players could look back on these sessions later down the road and just remember all of these awesome moments that they'd created together. I just think that's really cool. But along the way, I found that it's actually really, really handy functionally as well, as a DM. If I end up needing to remember something that happened 10 sessions ago for the story, chances are it's in a recap. It's great. Again, super unnecessary. I also print out extra copies to give to each of my players. So, arguably, the only thing more useless than the janky find trap spell in D&D is the CR ratings. Those little numbers for combat when you're trying to build an encounter that's meant to tell you how difficult it'll be for the players. If you go ahead and try to use the difficulty ratings on D&D Beyond for your encounters, you're going to get wildly different results. I don't necessarily think it's D&D Beyond's fault. For once, I think putting combat difficulty down to a number ranking is kind of impossible when you take into account things like party composition, player experience, etc. But I'm sure more seasoned DMs have and will talk about that. What I do want to mention though is what I personally do to try and make my combat encounters more balanced, or at least challenging but fair for the players. I'll add as well though that sometimes it's okay just to have combat encounters that are super easy for the players. Sometimes it's okay to show your players how strong they've gotten by maybe giving them an encounter that they've already done in the past, but this time they absolutely smash it because they're so much stronger. Or on the flip side of that, if your players are always running in guns blazing and never really strategizing or planning, then maybe they'll run into some enemies that they can't beat, or an ambush, or a room full of traps. With all that said though, here's what I do. I give myself 2 rounds. Only 2 where I can make some minor edits to the NPCs or the monsters that my players are fighting. I think 2 rounds in particular is enough without going overboard to gauge whether the enemies are too weak or too strong. So I might bump up or knock off some of their HP or their damage dice. After those 2 rounds are done though, that's it. Hands off. That's when it's in the hands of the players. I personally don't really like the idea of fudging dice rolls at my table, but I don't really have any issue with DMs that do. I think there's a lot of really fair arguments for fudging rolls in moderation. With that said, sometimes I might be a bit extra flexible. For example, let's say a player does something awesome. Your player rolls a nat 20 and they throw down a spiral of arcane lightning, saving their comrade and absolutely torching the enemy. And after all of that, after this really epic moment, the enemy has 2 HP left. I just think it's kind of lame to have that enemy hold out another turn or two until one of the other players bonks them with a sword. So in cases like that, I might just give that first player the W. Just an additional note about combat as well, something else that I learned the hard way, I guess, is that your players can get bored of combat. I know when I started, I had the false impression that if anything ever felt too boring, I could just throw in a fight and that would fix it. And that's just not really the case, or at least in my experience, that's not the case. Again, it'll depend on your players and what they like. And don't get me wrong, your players definitely can get hungry for a combat encounter if you make them wait too long. But combat isn't a magic solution to just making this session more exciting, is my point. Sometimes it's okay, and it's actually even better to have a couple of sessions where you're just moving the story forward, where you're letting the players explore and kind of do their own thing without throwing a fight at them. Because combat encounters can take quite a long time. Sometimes they can even take multiple sessions. And if it reaches the point where your players feel like all they're doing is fighting, then they're probably going to get bored. And I mean, if your players do start itching for a fight or itching to avoid one, they'll kind of let you know in the actions that they take in the session. Here's one that I've actually learned somewhat recently, and it's that there are a ton of great ways to reward your players for like great role-playing, clever thinking and problem solving, or involving other players in their shenanigans, or just being creative in general. You can give that player inspiration, and you should if you think they deserve it. You could also reward them with like an in-game magic item or something like that, in a way that makes sense for the story, of course, like don't just have it fall from the sky. But there is something that I have been trying that I think is way better. Rewarding the players in-game with story moments. It doesn't have to be anything big, don't get me wrong, it can be something as simple as a small line of dialogue from an NPC, but something that makes the character, not just the player, proud of themselves for what they did. I'll give you an example. Say that your player's paladin solves a very challenging puzzle. A puzzle that everyone else is struggling with, but this paladin comes up with a really creative solution that surprises even the DM, and in doing so they save the village blacksmith as a result. The blacksmith is so impressed by the paladin's clever thinking that he goes back to town and he spreads the word of this paladin's intellect. While your players are playing their campaign, in the background, that word is spreading. And now, a few sessions later, when the paladin introduces themselves to an NPC, that NPC responds with, "Oh, you're the paladin that solved the trial of the Crimson Mind." I don't know. I just think that's a really awesome callback that will make your player feel like a badass, because the main moral of the story there, the thing that I had to learn the hard way, is that you can't just reward your players by throwing magic items at them over and over. First of all, because it will make getting magic items feel a lot less special, and secondly, because it could throw off the entire balance of the game. If your players are completely decked to the teeth with magic items, then you, the DM, are going to have a much harder time preparing challenges for them, because they'll probably have an item that will just allow them to bypass whatever you put in front of them. Those are just 5 of the things that I have learned the hard way during my time as a still pretty new DM. I'm sure I have plenty more, but maybe that can be another video. What about you? What did you as a DM learn the hard way? Or maybe what did you as a player learn the hard way? Or what do you think about the things that we've discussed already? Let me know in the comments and maybe I'll chat about it in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. I really appreciate it. If you're a player, a DM, or even just interested in TTRPGs, then stick around, subscribe. I would love to have you here. Tell you what, because you watched to the end of the video, go ahead and tell your DM that I said you can roll with advantage. They'll know. Catch ya.